The global battle over money heats up. Now, one thing I've heard more than almost any other thing when it comes to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is that they will never allow something like that to happen because they won't give up control over money. But who is they? Who is they? Who are the players on the global strategic board game? Is it the Fed doesn't want to give up control to the ECB, give up control to the JOB, to Russia, China, you name it. And so in this conversation, we are going to discuss who are the warring factions. We're going to talk about the 4 spheres of influence, who the players are. We're going to talk about the age-old Game of Thrones and how this is breaking down. We're going to talk about how once you understand the 4 spheres of influence, how the rest of the picture becomes clear, from the sovereign debt crisis that we're witnessing to the banking crisis in the United States, well, and the rest of the world, the debt ceiling debate. All of these other things become clear when you understand it from a high level. So we'll talk about that with a returning guest, Tom Luongo, a fan favorite, a highly requested guest. He's been on the show multiple times, and we're going to discuss this, the warring factions, the sovereign debt crisis, the banking crisis, and more. Now, this went long. It was a 2-part episode. This is part 1. So make sure you watch part 2 after this. But let's go ahead and just jump right in with Tom. Tom Luongo, my viewers should know who you are. I've had you on a couple times. I've told people to follow you. Hopefully they are. You're a wealth of knowledge. More importantly than a wealth of knowledge, which is obviously important, but it's a different perspective. And that's what I love. And it's a very zoomed out perspective. And it's a creative perspective. And I think, a lot of times you have to look at these situations from different viewpoints. And specifically this zoomed out. And so right before we started recording, I was talking about it, and I want to bring about it as we were recording. But you just published so first of all, your view is much more zoomed out. So I want to talk about the sovereign debt crisis. I want to talk about the banking crisis, the debt ceiling debate, all of these things, how they're interrelated, capital controls that we're going into. And if we have time, might even get into what's going on with the Biden administration in regards to all this. But I think most people, when we look at this banking crisis or this debt ceiling debate, we just kind of look at it on this maybe runway or 5,000 foot kind of viewpoint. Right. You kind of zoom out and look at it from a more global geopolitical kind of viewpoint, which is zoomed out 20, 30,000 foot. And it helps bring clarity, right? Mm-hmm. Just like you would, obviously, if you go up. I was listening to this podcast on your show that you just released yesterday, which I'll link it in the show notes down below for anybody. And they started talking about Canada being owned by the Crown and Australia and how the colonies never got away from this and funding into World War II and Nazi Germany. And it's like, whoa, that's even a whole nother level. So, without getting into all that, we'll link to that down below for anybody that wants to. But Tom, how far do you have to zoom out to get clarity on what's going on, with these issues right now?
I'll tell you when I reach the bottom, or when I reach the top, because I don't know yet. Every time I uncover another layer, I get somebody else going, "Oh, by the way, dude, you still don't have it, right?" And now some of those that I get are a lot of that is what I like to call the overly black-pilled, who just want to believe that it's all just one big club and we ain't in it. But at the same time, a guy like Matt Arrett, which is the guest I had on my podcast that you're referring to, and a lot of people, there's a lot of crossover between my audience and Matt's, and that's why I had him on the show. And I wanted to have him on the show because he really does understand the place that the British Crown still holds in this entire affair. And I don't say I dance around it, but I understand why the UK is so important to what I've been considering as to be the other 2 factions. You've got U.S. Anglo neocons, you've got the kind of the Anglosphere, and then you have the European old colonial feudalists that.
And who do you throw into those 2 buckets?
Well, you've got the U.S. and UK, or the UK Commonwealth and the U.S., and then you have what I like to call Davos, which is really centered around Europe and the old European money. And there's a lot of crossover and there's a lot of cross-pollination, and there's a lot of sub-factions within that. There are Americans who are aligned with Davos. There are Americans who are aligned with the Crown. There are Americans who are like, oh, you're both crazy. Right. And so you have to be careful when you simplify these things, because if you can lose some of the nuance, which is part of the reason why I wanted to have Matt on the podcast, because I try to do my best to identify the factions, keep the narrative as simple but as detailed as possible, right? So you're trying to, identify the factions, show the game board as it exists, and then you can and that gives people the ability to then start filling in the little details here or there. And then from there, you can start watching all of the strategic moves and counter moves to see who is and who isn't, who's doing what and who's on what side. And then that allows you to error check, in your thesis as to who works for which faction. And that's what I do.
Hey, I just want to stop for a second and say I hope that you're enjoying this interview. We're starting at a very high lens, and we're going to drill down because if you get the big picture correctly, it helps you identify what's going on. When you understand where the storm is brewing and where it's sending the money, it's very easy to figure out where to put your investments. And so I'm going to have a special presentation next week that I'd like to bring your attention to and invite you to, where I'm going to talk about the banking collapse and the debt ceiling debate. What's really going on, what we should expect from that, and most importantly, how we position ourselves to protect our own investments as well as profit from this as it all happens. So people that aren't paying attention, unfortunately, they get hammered. But for those of us that are prepared, we can protect ourselves, and more importantly, we can take advantage of these situations. So join me next week. I'm going to do this offline. It's going to be about an hour presentation. I'm going to run through the slides, and I'm going to take all your questions and answers live. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm doing with my own money, the positions, the assets, the categories, and like I said, I'll answer all your questions live. You can sign up for free. Down below, there's a link. If you'd like to come hang out with me, I do these every couple of months when there's something big like this, and the banking crisis, the debt crisis is one of those. So come join me. Check out the link down below. And now let's go ahead and just jump right back into the interview with Tom.
So having Matt on to explain that, look, King Charles was just coronated. And if you go back to 2016 with the Trump presidency and Brexit happening within 4 months, you realize that those were both massive black eyes to the entire globalist project. And one of the ways I framed it to Matt when he and I were chatting about all this, and I've talked about it, and it's like my latest version of how to simplify this for the people to understand, is that you have old Trotskyites in the US and the UK, the neoconservatives, who literally are the intellectual heirs of Leon Trotsky. And then you have the Stalinists, for lack of a better term, in Europe, who literally, if you read what the WEF talks about, it's no different than, it's not that much different than Stalin. And so you have kind of, it's like, so you're watching this and it's really just Stalin versus Trotsky all over again. When I said that to Matt, I blew his mind, right?
Yeah.
And because he hadn't thought about it that way, but he's like, yeah, you're right. I'm like, exactly, because it's an ideological fight between who's going to control the Western oligarchy, for lack of a better term. And they're doing so, and they're fighting at this point because they realize that the system that they've erected is collapsing in the face of a global South led by Russia, China, and Iran, who are just saying no to the entire thing. Okay? So,
and in the past, when the thing collapses, there's a revolution, they lose control. And this time they want to control the revolution so right. They can end up on top of it.
Yeah, they just want the next iteration of the cycle to be a Who song. Meet the new right. boss, same as the old boss. Like that's the way a lot of people are trying to are kind of instinctually correct when they start to go down this path and they say, well, it's all just one big club and we ain't in it. But there are very different outcomes that will happen depending on which faction wins. And more appropriately, is there a faction actually saying nuts to both of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's important for us to understand that, because when we start looking at, and the things I want to talk about with you is, the banking crisis, this debt ceiling debate, capital controls. And so trying to figure out what's going to happen with this, if you don't understand who the players are on the table and what their ideologies are, then you don't really understand what's going on down here with these debates.
That's that's the way I look at it. And I've always looked at it that way. Because remember, Mark, I'm a strategic board gamer. Right, at heart.
Yeah.
I'm a guy who's been playing and analyzing systems from a strategic perspective my entire life. This is what I do for fun, right? When I sit down every Wednesday and I play strategic board games with my friends, and I've been doing it my entire life. So, and then at the same time, I'm also a scientist. people forget that, like, I spent 25 years as a bench chemist. I almost went to graduate school and got a PhD in high energy physics and quantum mechanics, right? So I have a different perspective on how you falsify and test hypotheses than we have today in our consensus-driven science motif that we have, a milieu that we have today,
Yeah.
which is it's anti-scientific in the same way that it's
Yeah.
anti-intellectual. So, and at the same time, I'm just a friggin' cynic because I know they're lying to us about everything, right?
Yeah.
And
you have to check that bias sometimes too,
and you
right?
do,
Like you said.
and you do. And I think that the best way to look at things is to not say trust but verify, but distrust but verify. It's better to assume that they're lying to us, and then every once in a while they tell us the kernel of truth.
Right.
Where they reveal
big,
reveal a kernel of truth about who they are and what they are.
That was the big piece that Tucker Carlson put out on Twitter. Got 100 million views, and he said, "What the media tells you is factually true. It can pass the fact checker, but it's intellectually dishonest because they omit so much stuff and they omit the entire context, and so it passes fact checking, but it's actually misleading and false, etc." And so kind of
the worst lies are the lies of omission. Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
So so that's where we are today. So when we start looking at what's happening at the big strategic level, and you start to identify, okay, well, if it was all one big club and we ain't in it, then interest rates would still be at the zero bound, because it's the zero bound interest rate policy that blew up this whole thing. There's no art. There's in this case, correlation is causality, meaning in the acceleration of woke culture and everything else. And my dog agrees with me, by the way. The acceleration of this agenda and the acceleration of them attacking the foundations of Western society, spiritually, morally, intellectually, legally, politically, economically, and everything else, turbocharged under zero-bound interest rate policy and coordinated central bank policy. Okay, which began after the fall of Lehman Brothers.
Yeah. Let's start by identifying the strategic players on the board. So you've talked about warring factions. You kind of sized up a couple of them.
Sure.
So who's on the board that you see a couple warring factions? So in the U.S. there's multiple factions.
Sure.
In Europe there's multiple factions. Obviously you mentioned the rise of the BRICS. There's factions, and I think just understanding that they all have their own interests, but also work together.
Yeah, remember, the Venn diagram of their interests in geopolitics has overlap, right?
Yeah. So just give us like an idea of who these players are.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Let's start with the big high level one. You've got basically 4 spheres of influence, or 3 spheres of influence. Let's just start at the beginning. You've got everybody who doesn't want to be aligned with the West, which is pretty much what you can term the global South: Russia, China, most of Asia, South America, Northern Africa. The Middle East.
All the BRICS, basically.
The BRICS is a nice way of consolidating that. You have Europe and you have the United States. And at times, they are aligned. When we're talking about, and so now we're talking about along which vector are they aligned? Well, they're aligned with the vector of trying to subjugate Russia and China. Because they realize that if they subjugate Russia and China, that everybody else falls in line.
But when you say Europe, are you talking about like the European Union, or are you talking about the Davos Europe group? Because
as far as I'm concerned, the European Union and Davos are almost the exact. The European Union is the main political arm of Davos.
Okay. The only reason why I asked that is because we can see like Macron is like seemingly wanting to now team up with China, right? He feels offended by a lot of things, potentially the IRA deal that Biden put forward, right?
So let's back up for a second, okay? And let's talk about this. Go back to the beginning of the conflict, which was that they had a plan. And that plan was to get Russia involved in a land war in Ukraine, create a civil war in Ukraine that would bind the Russians down and destroy them, right? It would drain them of all their vitality. It would drain them of their money. It would drain them of their political will. It would overthrow Putin and all of this stuff. That process began it started 15 years ago. It culminates in the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, and the breaking away of Crimea and everything else that's happened since then. Everybody was aligned with this in 2014. France, Germany, the United States, the Brits, everybody was like, oh, but they may have been there for different reasons. Okay?
Right.
So the neocons...
Well, they're always out there for their own interests,
right.
But they align somewhere.
So the Trotskyites and the Stalinists were both on board with destroying Russia. That's where their Venn diagram overlaps, right? But it doesn't overlap when it comes to who's going to control the Western world after they've destroyed Russia. And if it comes down to they can't destroy Russia as the operation goes along, who breaks with the cartel? Okay, so that's where you're getting this stuff from Macron saying, oh, maybe we should end the war. Notice that Davos, what I identify as Davos, has started to pull back from the idea of wanting to go to war continue the war with Russia. Now they want to sue for peace in Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. Whereas the neocons in the Anglosphere in America are going whole hog. Now let's start talking about relative power. I think Davos is far more powerful than the Anglo neocons. Okay? Period. I've said this for 3 years. I've said Davos is far more powerful than the American neocons are. The neocons are just stupid and belligerent to the point of being they're an easy spear to point at their preferred target. You give them an opportunity to attack the Russians or the Chinese, and they will take it. Doesn't matter whether it furthers their long-term plans or not. They don't care. Like, they don't care if they burn the country to the ground. They don't care about the final outcome. As long as any money or power that they can spend to subjugate Russia and China, they will take. Okay? So they become easy, useful idiots for Davos. And I've been saying this for a long, long time. Meaning, Davos always wanted to destroy the Russians, but they wanted the neocons to do it. They wanted us, the Americans, to fight that war for them. Because if you're the weak man at the table, and I believe that Europe is the weak guy at the table. So if I'm thinking about this as a 3 or 4 player game.
Well, certainly militarily they are.
Well, certainly economically they are. Certainly from a resource perspective they are. Certainly from a political perspective they are, because they don't have the ability to tax across borders. They don't have a unified debt structure. The euro is a terrible currency. I can do this stuff until 4 o'clock. We're recording a little after 1 p.m. Eastern time. So I can do this for 3 hours, right? But we don't want to go too far granular into that. So let's just look at the weak man at the table. You got basically four players. You got the Russia, China, Iran axis. You've got the rest of the global south. You've got Europe, and you got the United States.
All right, I want to take just another quick break, real quick, because I know you're hearing all this information and hopefully it's fascinating and interesting. But what do you do with it? Knowledge isn't power. Only actionable knowledge is power. So what do you do with this to protect your investments and grow your investments? And so I'm going to have a presentation next week. We're going to break this down. I'm going to run through a whole presentation to show you what's going on and more specifically what asset classes I think are the best ones to get into and what I'm doing with my own money. And then I do live Q&A where I'll answer all of your questions live for everybody so we can all learn together. We can all work together as a community. It's a free event. I do these every couple of months when there's something big. You can check it out. You can sign up down below. There's a link. Like I said, this is interesting, but what do you do with it? That's what we're going to discuss, what I'm doing with it and what you can do as well. Sign up down below for free. I hope to see you there. And now let's go ahead and just jump right back in with Tom.
Okay, and in the middle of this, and what they're fighting over is the British Commonwealth. Control of which side in the Davos versus neocon divide is the British Commonwealth, is the British Crown going to go? I argued under Liz and under Trump, they were pulling back towards the colonies and going to leave Europe in a lurch, and Europe has executed their coup to get rid of Liz. I don't know if they got rid of Liz or she just, finally died, but they got rid of Liz Truss, put in Rishi Sunak, and now they've blackmailed the Bank of England last summer over the pension funds going bust. They own all of it. They have now effectively betrayed Brexit. It's now back within the EU sphere, and with the coronation of King Charles, that's what they always wanted anyway. They've reversed Brexit in every fundamental way. So here's the next thing to think about. So now you've got useful idiots and the neocons, and how does Europe win in this 4-player game? They keep their colonies in North Africa. They keep their ability to do their debt slavery colonization thing, because they now control the IMF. Davos controls the IMF and the World Bank. The U.S. does not anymore. Georgieva at the IMF is a is a Davos plant, just like Lagarde was. Okay? All right, so they were put there by Klaus Schwab. And David Malpass, who was the head of the World Bank, put there under Trump, was thrown out a couple of months ago. So they own control of the World Bank and the IMF at this point.
Let me show you this chart right here. I don't know if you've seen this chart before. I've used it in a few videos.
So as that's coming up, because I haven't seen it yet, so now you've got this opportunity here. Public, global, policy distributors, policy enforcers, policy propagandists, and then the policy subject, us. Yes, but here's the problem. So here's the problem. The central banks are not all aligned anymore.
Because some of them are under the policy enforcers, the national governments.
Because they haven't been able to break down all the national governments yet. Yes.
Right.
So who
but
controls?
So who controls? You have the WF there above, to your point, the IMF, right? Yes. UN, World Bank, et cetera, WHO. But above that, you have the BIS. And so, is it a situation where, as long as everybody comes into the BIS fold, they don't really care who squabbles over the scraps down below?
I would argue that I don't even know ultimately that the BIS is all as powerful as everybody wants. I'm not even sure I believe ultimately that the BIS is that powerful. I think that we put the BIS there, the central bank of the central banks, but the central banks are now fighting amongst themselves. And because of that, the entire power, that entire tree now is splintering into warring factions. That is a great pictorial representation of what it looks like when it's all one big club and we ain't in it. Okay? This is my argument, that chart was accurate for a very, very long time. And it has not been accurate since 2016.
Okay.
And it's been civil war amongst the oligarchs since then. Okay?
Okay.
So
with that frame of mind, then we can move down. Now that we've kind of identified who the players on the board are, now we can identify the game. Now,
before we do that, I needed to put the punctuation, the period on the point, which is you've got four big players. Who's the weakest one at the table? It's the weakest one at the table is the global South, right? But they own so much of the population and so much of the natural resources that the other three, that the weakest major player at the table, which would be Davos or Europe, needs control of all that. How do they win that fight? How do they win? They get numbers 1 and 2 to fight each other. They get the Russia-China alliance, China-Iran alliance to fight the United States. And you just expend all of your energy, what's left. And we have no balance sheet room here in the West. You can fight this war financially. You can fight this war kinetically. You can fight it politically. You can fight it diplomatically. You can fight it at every level. And when you stop to really think about it, the United States doesn't have the balance sheet room left to fight to prosecute this fight for any length of time.
Nor do we have the manufacturing base.
So how are you going to rebuild a manufacturing base in order to fight this war, even if you had the balance sheet room, which you don't. Okay? And you don't have and Davos's plan of dividing the United States into warring factions. Right.
And I'm just going to say for everybody paying attention, on the WEF website, they have posted that the U.S. will no longer be the superpower by 2030.
Oh, yeah. They're just ripping off of Martin Armstrong at this point.
I'm just saying, though, like that's on their website. So to back up what you're saying, like this is a proclaimed goal. They've said this. To me, when I saw that years ago, I'm like, that seems like an act of war.
It kind of is, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
So when you start to look at how does the WEF operate? Well, they operate by getting top-down control of the countries through political power and through economic power. So if you have monetary and political control over the countries on which all of global policy rests, is the fulcrum, right? Then if you control the United States, both politically and monetarily, if you control the Brits politically and monetarily, if you control Europe politically and monetarily, well, what do you need? Well, you control the Saudis politically and you control the Saudis monetarily through the real peg. Now you have control of the price. You have control over the supply of oil until the rise of Russia as the marginal barrel of oil supplier in the world, more so than the Saudis. Now the Russians and the Saudis together run OPEC. On the other side, you have, as Matt Ehret pointed, and I were talking about in that podcast, you have Hong Kong as the gateway to China, right? But who controls the Hong Kong Monetary Authority? The Hong Kong Central Bank. Guess who? The Brits. Okay.
Even after China's taken Hong Kong, the Brits still hold the banking?
They own control of the banking system because they own like Standard Chartered. All the City of London banks are the conduits. So how does China interface with the rest of the world? It does so through Hong Kong. That's the main source for offshore yuan. Now they still have a controlled capital account, so they control. So China completely controls the onshore yuan, but the West in many ways controls the offshore yuan and does so through the Hong Kong dollar peg. And now the Hong Kong dollar peg has been under sincere pressure over and this is one of those things that I don't have a big handle on yet. I know it's important, but it's like I know I'm missing a piece to this puzzle, right? And this is part of the problem with doing the top-down analysis like I do, is that sometimes you miss some of the plumbing stuff. But what I've found is if I put these ideas out into the public, guess what happens? I get emails, I get new patrons, and they all come in and go, oh, by the way, this is what you're missing, and I go, oh, thank you, and then I incorporate that into my thinking, and it's been an absolutely brilliant real-time collaborative experience between myself and the rest of the world. I can see it. So
the power of the crowd.
Power of the crowd. I've always said that you may be the smartest guy in the room, but you're not smarter than the room.
Right. Which is why central planning always fails.
Right. This is why central planning always fails, as you and I and Alex talked about when you guys were on my podcast, right? Yeah. Pimping your book, The UnCommunist Manifesto, FYI, which everybody should read.
Oh, thanks for that plug.
Sure, no problem.
Shout out. We'll put a link to the UnCommunist Manifesto down there below. So thank you for that. Okay, so that's the board, and that's some of the players that are on there. Now, one would think that everybody, all the players on the board need players. You can't play a game by yourself. So China can continue to produce all the goods, but they can't buy their own goods. Neither can the Global South.
Well, they can to some extent. Remember, they're trying to bring all these people up into the middle class. How do they do that? They get control of their energy, they get control of their food supply and everything else. So, and they've been kind of successful at this. Here's one that, for those in the audience who still think that China doesn't exist without the United States, it's true, but it's not wholly true. Okay, when I was studying Southeast Asia, this is where I really started to think about geopolitics, because I was working with a guy in Vietnam. I was a nobody at the time. I was actually ghostwriting under his name, and I was learning a lot of this stuff. One of the things, and we were looking at the world from a Vietnamese perspective because that's where he was. And one of the things that became obvious to me was, and in my research at that time, was that China does not peg really the yuan to the dollar. The exchange rate for the yuan is not set by the dollar, even though we're China's biggest trading partner and all of this other stuff. There's more correlation between the exchange rate of the yuan with the ASEAN Tiger 5, meaning Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, and who's the fifth one? Indonesia, than it is with the dollar. If you look at the real effective exchange rate of the Chinese yuan, there's a much higher correlation to its exchange rate versus those 5 countries than versus the dollar. And this, you can look this up on the St. Louis Fed actually tracks this. This is where I found this data, and I went and you can see the data is very clear. So the Chinese have understood for a while that it's far more important for them, in many ways, and the biggest thing here is that these are their primary suppliers of food, raw materials, and all the things they need to run their economy. They send the finished goods to the United States and to Europe, but the raw capital goods come in from the ASEAN Tiger 5, right? Now, and others, but because of that, they have to be much more careful in how they prosecute monetary policy to keep the yuan relatively stable to those 5 countries. Otherwise, they destroy those 5 countries' economy. Okay, so they manage it that way, and that's far more important to them. That's very important. That's been going on for over 10 years. Okay, so it's another one of those things when people talk about
10 years. China 10 years ago, China basically announced their de-dollarization plan. Right, China and Russia embarked on that de-dollarization plan about 10 years ago.
Really 13 years ago when China announced a doubling of their gold foreign exchange reserves, which is what set the central banks to start accumulating gold. With the day from literally to the day in June of 2010 when China doubled their official gold reserves, that was the signal to the rest of the world: you need to start accumulating gold as a reserve asset because we're going to move the world off of the dollar.
Keyword official. Many analysts think
keyword.
that China could have 20, 30,000 tons of gold. We don't know. We know it's official. This year, like a couple months in a row, they officially announced that they've added.
Yeah.
I forget how much it was
Not
per
much,
month, but
40, 50 tons, nothing, a rounding error relative to the China's balance sheet.
right. But they didn't acquire that much gold. They announced that they acquired that much gold, and so why, and what's the timing, and all that. So
Right.
anyway, side
It's
note
just
on that.
well, and what they're doing is they're piggybacking on the very, very public data at this point that central bank buying is the marginal unit in the gold market, right? This is where we are. So central bank buying now accounted, I think, for it was 15% in 2021 of all gold purchases. I think it was 18% last year. These numbers may be wrong. I think we're expecting 20 to 21% of all gold purchases this year to be central bank buying. Now, the gold production is relatively stable at around 3,500 tons a year. Now, it goes up and down depending on the gold price, and with gold at 2,100, I firmly expect to start seeing those numbers rise. But relatively speaking, you can, if it rises at all, the supply of gold rises in the world at less than 1% a year at this point. It doesn't really matter. So
Yeah. So you were talking about, I was talking about zooming out to get a better perspective. You were talking about diving down and peeling back layers, but you're really peeling up layers.
Yeah.
So it's like you're climbing up to a high peak so you can get a good vantage point. So now we've got that good vantage point. We've kind of framed up this world, and so now let's like now we'll start diving down into these rabbit holes. And so I don't know where we want to start. One thing I want to ask you about is, so we're witnessing this sovereign debt crisis all over the world.
Right.
You had talked about, you did an amazing interview with Caitlin Long, which I shared on Twitter. I thought it was great.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about this money, like this financial easing musical chairs.
Mm-hmm.
And each nation has sort of had their turn. And I think you said that you think Japan is next.
Well, the way I describe the coordinated central bank policy of the last, up until 2021, from the announcement of the coordinated central bank policy in September of 2011, when the major central banks all got together and created a $500 billion slush fund for them to liquidity pool, for them to get currency of each other's currency. That was the beginning of coordinated central bank policy, and really, and with Bernanke's going to the zero bound and launching QE1 to put the money in the fund, basically, and everybody kind of followed suit. For 10 years after that, what you had was, you'd have the U.S. would do QE for a while, then they'd stop, and then the Bank of England would take over, or I don't remember the order here, it doesn't really matter. And then they would do it for a while, and then the ECB would expand their balance sheet a little bit, then the SNB, then the BOJ, and they would do this round robin QE constantly, slowly but surely, all bringing up the size of their balance sheets in order to recapitalize the banking system, but also to create the amount of leverage necessary to make the credit markets, the offshore credit markets, dwarf in size any domestic banking reserves, right?
Right.
And to the point of, was it you that sent me the article this morning?
Yeah, about the GSIB attack.
About the GSIB attacks and all that. And when I said, so Mark sent me a great article this morning for me to read in the prep for this podcast, and I read the whole thing right before I had to go out and get my car service this morning.
I thought maybe you could read it while you're getting your car service.
Yeah, no, I read it before I left, and I'm sitting there, and I'm this is what I did even before coffee, and I'm reading this thing, and I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ. But it's fine. It's all good. I'm just sharp enough when I wake up in the morning that I can do this stuff. And I read it, and I went, Oh, he's describing everything absolutely properly, except that China's not the only one doing it. Which is that what this guy was arguing for, and I don't remember his name off the top of my head, Deep Throat IP, I think.
Yeah, he writes under the name Deep Throat. I'll link to the article in the show notes so everyone can go read it if they want. It's a little scary.
It is very scary, but it's also not very different than the kind of thing that I've been talking about, which is that, banks are being executed. The question
this goes into the banking crisis, and so if you take a thing, maybe the banks made some bad decisions, but if you kind of peel back some of the layers, it looks like some of these banks were kind of put to sleep that didn't need to be put to sleep, and so to Tom's point, some of them are being executed, and this guy wrote this article saying that it may be being done intentionally, and he kind of explained it. So go ahead, Tom.
I firmly believe it all has been being done intentionally. The question is by whom.
Right.
See, if you go back, and again, this is an idea of that, and literally I was thinking about this talking point on my way in when I was driving into town this morning after I read the article, and I said, well, go back to 2009 when Jim Rickards used to go on Capital Account with Lauren Lister and Dimitri Kofinas. I used to watch that show religiously, not just because Lauren Lister was hot as balls, but because the show was great, right? It was really the best thing, and then the minute she got bought by Yahoo, I'm like, oh, her career's up there. Like, sorry, I hate to say it, Lauren, but that was a bad move. You were better off on RT. But Jim Rickards kept going on to Capital Account and explaining what was going on with rehypothecation and all of this stuff. And I'm like, he's telling you what the plan is here, which is that this money is sloshing around and can be used. And he pointed, I remember him doing a Porter Stansberry promotion, right, where 45 minutes of them explaining how China would execute the gold market to destroy and bring the price of gold up to $7,000 an ounce, and this is how they could do it. And I'm like, well, of course. That's one angle on it, but you can do that with euro dollars just as easily as anything else. You can do this with offshore dollars or credit dollars just as easily as you can do it in the gold market. If somebody has a concentrated position in a particular thing, and at the time Rickards was talking about China owning about 20% of the gold futures contracts that were out there and on the LBMA and the COMEX, well, they could execute the gold rigging system. They could kill that in no time flat, and that's another form of the shadow banking stuff, right? Well, it's the same thing here. Like, if Davos levers up all these friggin' ridiculous credit dollars, and China and anybody else levers up all these stupid credit dollars and stuffs them into these banks, and then just pulls the money out, you have a bank, and then does a whisper campaign on Twitter. You can have a bank run, you can execute a bank, any bank in no time flat. This is economic hitman stuff. This is no different than the last 5 years of the Turkish lira, folks. This is how they've blown up Argentina 15 times. This is what they do.
To frame it up for people that didn't get to read the article, so basically what he's explaining, what the article explained, and he has a little bit of a different take, which I want to talk about, but basically Paulson, in the 2008 Great Financial Crash, they went to China, asked for help with this banking collapse, which kind of exposed the inner workings of our banking system, exposed the weaknesses, et cetera. Over the last 20 years, through this expansion of this offshore dollar market, which is what he's talking about, so we've had the euro dollar market expand over the last 20 years, trade imbalances, et cetera. China has amassed all these offshore dollars and stuffed them into offshore banks. The top 4 banks in the world are China banks. Yep. So I want to get your take on that, on why you think it's
I agree with
China,
that. But at the same
let
time,
me just kind of finish the last couple pieces. So the top 4 banks in the world are China banks. And then with the adversarial take that we have with China, Russia, basically what could be done, as he argued, is they put all this money into a bank, which is how you saw these last banks go. The banks, what do they do with the money? Well, then they put it into long-dated treasuries or whatever they do. And then all you do is just click a button and transfer money from one bank to the next, which creates a bank run.
Yep.
That bank collapses. It doesn't affect the person doing the transfer, because they just move money from one to another. It doesn't matter to them. They just push a button because money can move that fast. And so what he's arguing is potentially this is what happened, or easily could happen. China having the shadow banking system, top 4 banks in the world. I think he argued, like JP Morgan, the top of the heap, has about 800 billion. Right. They've got trillions. So they can put trillions in, they can pull trillions out, and it doesn't affect them, but it collapses the bank one by one.
Well, I agree with the general thesis, but I look at it this way. If China knows that they're gearing up for a long-term war against the United States, and they know that the United States is going to fight a war with them across multiple verticals, wouldn't you want to be building them? To me, these are all just financial nuclear weapons.
We don't have to guess. We know they are. They've already said as much. They're preparing for sanctions and all that.
Well, and Like, I remember, Mark, I think the first time I was on, it was right after I wrote the article I did about Archegos Capital, and I called it Archegos Bikini Atolls, meaning that Archegos Capital was a landmine left behind in the financial system to blow up at a moment's notice. As I think the Chinese did this. They blew up Archegos Capital on purpose to remind everybody, oh, by the way, we can take down all the primary dealers and the prime brokers like that.
Yeah.
Okay, because how do these people get this dumb? It was a theory. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. The point is that when you think in these terms, all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, they're weapons. Now, is this financial mutually assured destruction? Right? Is that what we have here? Because the United States can cancel all the QSIPs on the $850 billion worth of bonds that the Chinese have. That's a financial nuclear weapon, right? So wouldn't it make sense for China to sit down and amass a whole bunch of reserves that they could move into and out of our own capital, our banking system? Of course they can. Here's the other one. And this is my problem with the article that the guy wrote, and it feels like he glows a little bit, frankly, is that guess who actually does this on a regular basis? It's not the Chinese. It's the fucking Europe does this. These Davos bastards are the ones that do this shit. They're the ones that destroy countries. They're the ones that use the IMF and the World Bank to lend a whole bunch of money to a country, put the hot money in there, extract all the wealth out of the country, and then when the country says, this is terrible, and they elect the wrong government, guess what they do? They pull all the hot money out, they collapse the banking system, they collapse their friggin' their government budgets and everything else, and then they refuse to negotiate $1 worth of haircut on the debt. And then
you forgot the color revolution part, but
yeah, well, there's the color revolution part. Then the new government comes in and is forced to sign a horrible deal with the IMF to, keep them in perpetual debt slavery for the next 15 years until.
But hasn't China been doing that through this Belt and Road Initiative? I mean, they've also been trying to colonize people through.
Well, they do, but they do it differently. And I'm not saying that when given the opportunity, when they're the dominant player. Say we talk post 2030. Sure, is China going to probably do the same thing? Probably. I'm not ascribing any moral, certitude or decency to the Chinese. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is everybody has this ability. Okay? They all have access to an unbelievable amount of capital because of a decade's worth of zero-bound interest rates. And how do you destroy that money? How do you destroy that leverage? Let's say, for example, because this is the one thing you got to realize. You can sit here and run all the numbers and there's $448 trillion worth of money floating around out there. Yeah, that's nice, but it's all notional value. It's not real value.
Right.
Because it's all derivatives and this and that and everything else. It norms out to a lot less money than that, right? Well, if the Fed raises the cost of rehypothecation and rollover from 0% to 5.5% and starts pulling $95 billion worth of base money off their balance sheet every month, and let's say that this stuff is conservatively leveraged at 5 times. When it's probably much more than that.
Sure.
Every month, the Fed is pulling $500 billion almost of base money out of the global economy. So these weapons are degrading. It's almost like nuclear warheads who sitting in silos, and their half-life is ticking down on the warhead, and we have to go in and recommission the warheads on a regular basis in order for them to be still viable after they've been sitting in the tubes for 30 years. Because, well, you know what I mean. So, and this is part of the maintenance cycle of nuclear weapons. Well, it's the same thing with these things. If the Fed is doing this, then they're pulling. Again, after I read that article this morning, I started thinking about what this actually means, and this is what came out of my head, which was they're pulling like $500 billion worth of base money out of the global money supply, and that's what I've been saying.
Unlevers all the weapons.
Right, it unleverages all the weapons. It makes the numbers not nearly as scary, And now,
so we're talking about the banking crisis now, and so to the point, if China has this money and they could attack, but Davos has the money, IMF, there's a bunch of people on the strategic board that could do these types of attacks. Sort of like in the Cold War, everybody built up their nuclear arsenal and you had mutually assured destruction. Now everyone's built up this financial arsenal, and we have this mutually assured destruction. And so there's not just China, but potential other players that could do these types of attacks on the banking system. And so if the Fed jacks up rates to 5%, unlevers all those positions, then it basically neuters a lot of those potential weapons that are out there.
So now all the small tac nukes, like in this metaphor, the tac nukes, the small nukes are all they've all they're no longer critical mass. All they can
and
do.
The problem is you can't taper a Ponzi. We've all heard that. I think maybe Max Kaiser's the one that kind of started that.
Right.
But I think you made the point that you can taper it for a little while. And so it's like chemotherapy. It's like chemotherapy, right? Like it kills my body, but the goal is it kills the cancer first, and then I stop the chemo, and then I can recover. And so if the Fed goes on this rate hiking cycle, they cause a banking crisis. And unfortunately, some of the banks collapse, and sure, we have a recession in the United States, but they also neuter these other weapons, and then, like chemotherapy, they could stop this rate hiking cycle, this tightening.
Hold everything at 5.5% for a year and a half. Run the balance sheet down, and all the rest of it. Absolutely. Right. So now let's think. So you're absolutely correct. That's the kind of the way I look at it. Just remember that you can taper a Ponzi as long as you're the biggest Ponzi.
Yeah.
You're just not tapering. Your Ponzi is not being tapered. Everybody else's is being tapered at 5 times the rate that yours is.
Well, it is being tapered. I mean, we are being tapered in the United States. I mean, we're having banks collapse. The U.S. Treasury's now broke. I mean, all those other things.
Yeah,
so
but
we're feeling the effects of it.
The Treasury is broke because the Biden administration is spending like a drunken sailor, and they're doing it on purpose in order to force a crisis. And what a shock! Isn't it just convenient that the General Treasury account of the Janet Yellen led Treasury Department is running out of money in the same couple of weeks that LIBOR is going away. Huh. You don't say, Janet. The deuce you say. Seriously. Can you not be more frickin' obvious?
So explain that.
Okay. Okay. What is LIBOR? LIBOR is the debt indexing rate.
Exchange. Right.
It's the London Interbank Offer Rate. It's ultimately a debt indexing rate.
Right. Which is set by a good old boys club, right?
Well, just think of it this way.
It's not a market rate.
Well, it's not a market rate. It's set by an old boys club. But what does it do for those of you who are not that financially savvy? Well, LIBOR is that which is written into your mortgage or your credit card rate, right? It's written into any debt instrument in U.S. dollars that up until very recently it was all of them. So if you wanted a mortgage, you were going to pay, Fed funds, and LIBOR was going to be, somewhat indexed to the Fed funds rate, but you weren't buying Fed funds plus 3% with your mortgage. You were buying LIBOR plus 3% or LIBOR plus 4%. Now, if you have a bunch of London banks and a bunch of European banks that are levered up on the dollar base that's out there more than the American banks are, right? So they're more vulnerable to a rising Fed funds rate. What happens? Well, LIBOR eventually will blow out faster than the Fed funds rate. And the spread between the Fed funds rate and LIBOR will blow out. I think that is ultimately what the FRA OAS index, the spread is, which Zero Hedge is, maniacal about tracking blowouts in. I happen to think that the FRA OAS spread has now been replaced by SOFR. And that's part of the problem, that LIBOR is not the law of the land anymore because most of the debt in the United States is indexed to SOFR because we've had a 5-year rollout of the secured overnight financing rate, which is a market rate and a secured rate set by transactions in the U.S. Repo markets.
But the problem is there's a lot of danger there because as we saw in 2019, if that repo market seizes up through some banking crisis, that rate could jack up.
Sure, but that was when SOFR was illiquid.
Okay.
That's when most of the debt wasn't indexed to SOFR. SOFR futures have already killed Eurodollar futures. In 2019, the SOFR futures market was completely illiquid. It hadn't become law of the land. It was still in the rollout phase. And what happened was J.P. Morgan and possibly some others refused to take European sovereign debt as collateral for a repo contract at par. I'm sure that Jamie Dimon and his repo desk offered, Greek bonds 75 cents on the dollar in repo, but not a dollar.
Right.
And so eventually, that's what's caused mostly what caused the SOFR blowout in 2019, the repo crisis, which the Fed had to step in and do something about. But it was done as the beginnings of the process of decoupling U.S. banking system from that of the LIBOR-based banking system. And these systems are not going to go. You're not going to switch from SOFR to LIBOR without there being problems. And so, things are going to break. Because things have to break.
You have a quadrillion dollars, potentially, $1 quadrillion or more tied to this. Mm-hmm. What could go wrong?
A lot, right? A lot could go wrong. And so we had some things go wrong. The Fed stepped in, did what it was supposed to do, provided elastic money to the markets in order to get through their funding mismatches through time, which is what they're supposed to do. I hate to break it to everybody. I hate to break it to all the anarcho-capitalists in society, but oh, by the way, we don't live in a world of free banking. I'd love for us to live in a world of free banking, but we don't, and so therefore we have to deal with the world we have, not to deal and analyze the world we have, not the world we want to have. And in many ways, by the way, Bitcoin doesn't fix this, other than putting massive discipline on the system so that it never gets that leveraged ever again. Okay, because Bitcoin will always trade with a positive yield spread because of the fact that its emission rate is so low, similar to gold.
Meaning it can't go unwind and fix all of this, but it could create a new system that you could build on that would prevent this from being created again.
Yeah, it's always the parallel system that will force discipline on the old system. I don't get me wrong. You know I love Bitcoin. Yeah.
No, I know, but it will fix it because it won't unravel it and fix it, but it will create a parallel system that will then force constraint onto that system and eventually build a system that this couldn't be built on top of.
And guess what the BRICS are doing? The BRICS are doing the exact same thing, but with digital gold.
Right. Which is the same,
and that's
lead to the same problem that we had before.
And that's ultimately what we're going to be dealing with, which is why Powell has to raise interest rates, which is why he has to collapse the offshore dollar markets, which is why he has to set monetary policy for the United States and get control of it away from private equity and Wall Street. And that's what he's doing, and doing to the howls of the private equity markets. They're screaming about this, and every day they're like out there on Bloomberg and CNBC and Bubble Vision and everywhere else screaming that we can't do this. Well, yes, we can, but because if we don't do this, it will be the end of the United States, and it will be the end of the U.S. dollar. Now, who wants the end of the U.S. dollar?
A lot of people.
Not China. They just want the end of dollar diplomacy. They want the end of dollar hegemony. They don't give a damn about the dollar any more than we really give a damn about the yuan, or at least we should. The people who want the end of the dollar is in Europe, because the WEF wants to transfer all the power of sovereign governments to bloc governments, with the UN, the IMF, and the BIS as the issuers and emitters of all money and credit, divorced from any discipline to gold, Bitcoin, or any kind of bearer asset. That's what they want, and they want to enforce that through digital, basically putting you in a digital ghetto. Well, you said some nasty things about Klaus Schwab on Twitter. You don't get to eat today. Right. You're only allowed to have 50 grams. You're only allowed to buy 50 grams worth of animal protein a month, because that's what we've determined is sustainable.
Or so many gallons of gas, or
whatever. And that's ultimately what they, and remember that these are the people that ultimately, when you look at everything they do, it is always about clamping down escape routes. Who's most hostile to Bitcoin? Davos.
Yeah.
The United States is very split on Bitcoin. The Davos trolls, the people I think who are aligned with Davos, the Genslers and the Yellens, they hate Bitcoin. Powell doesn't care about Bitcoin. He hates stable coins, because stable coins are synthetic dollars, and he wants control of dollars.
All right, that's a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation with Tom Luongo. I know it was long, but hopefully it was worth it. Hopefully it was entertaining. I truly believe that you have to zoom out in order to understand what's going on the surface level. And hopefully this viewpoint at least gives you another lens to view the world through. Now, I've linked some resources for Tom down below and some of the resources that we discussed. So if you want to go get more reading, it's all linked down below. Of course, as always, let me know what you think. If there was a certain part that you liked, I'd love it if you just put a timestamp in on the comments. And other than that, of course, as always, give me a thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you didn't. That's okay. At least tell me why in the comments. Subscribe if you're not subscribed already. And that's what I got. To your success. I'm out.